Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and on behalf of the Center, I welcome you to today's talk by Carlos Martín on building equity into federal investments for housing resilience. Before I introduce Carlos, I have a few announcements and a couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know about two upcoming events. On Friday, October 15th, again at 12:15 p.m., the Housing Research Seminar will continue when Samara Scheckler, a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center, will speak about new research she and others at the Center are doing on whether older homeowners with mortgages spend significantly less on healthcare than those who don't. This is a really important and, at least until now, understudied question. On Thursday, October 21st at noon, the Center, along with the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College, is co-sponsoring a session on zoning and equity that will feature Sarah Bronin, a professor at Cornell University, Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Harley Etienne, an associate professor at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Planning and Architecture. That'll be moderated by Amy Dane, a consultant who for over 2 decades now has been doing really important work on land use regulation in Greater Boston. I also want to let any Kennedy School and GSD students who are watching know that the Joint Center is again offering small grants to offset travel and other expenses you might incur as you prepare your master's theses at GSD or your PAEs at the Kennedy School. You can find the application deadline for that will be late October. You can find more information about these events and grants on our webpage. Also, here's some logistics related to today's talk. As always, you can submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can, but I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. We've enabled Zoom's automatic transcription feature that you can turn that on using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, or at least at the bottom of my screen. And finally, we will be posting a video of today's talk and of the slides that Carlos is using. Those should be up by early next week. Now, having gotten all of that out of the way, I am thrilled to introduce today's speaker. Carlos Martín is the relatively new director of the Center's Remodeling Futures program, which focuses on the more than $400 billion that Americans spend each year renovating, repairing, and rehabilitating our existing housing stock. Carlos, who also is the Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program and a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel on accelerating decarbonization in the United States, has been studying and working on housing issues for more than 2 decades, most recently as a senior fellow in the Urban Institute's Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. Carlos will be speaking today about recent and ongoing work about whether and how we might do a better job of bringing equity considerations into efforts, particularly federal efforts, to make our housing more resilient. He'll speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. When he's done, I'll moderate a Q&A session, which, as I mentioned, will draw heavily on the questions you'll submit via Zoom. We'll wrap things up no later than 1:15 p.m. Carlos, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, David. You don't know how much of a pleasure it is to hear the term relatively new applied to somebody my age. So thank you for saying that. But something that makes me even more happier is actually to finally have this conversation with my fellow housers. The reality is I've given this talk to several climate people, housing risk people, a wide range of folks. And unfortunately, I've never been able to really speak to my fellow housers around this. And so it's a real joy to bring this conversation to you all. So as I load up my slides, I'm assuming you can see them all. David, if you can give me a
yes, we can see it.
All right, perfect, great. So again, it's a real pleasure to be addressing a housing audience when it comes to this conversation. And I should note that, as you see though, on this front slide is that I don't present a house. I feel that the current state of federal investments in housing resilience is much more of a roller coaster, a different kind of built structure. You may know this infamous scene. This is the Jetstar roller coaster off the Casino Pier in Sunnyside Heights in New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy. So there's a lot of confusion by politicians, by activists, by scholars around the issues of housing resilience, and particularly around what the federal role is. And a lot of this, unfortunately, is perpetuated by the media. Here's a case in point.
Climate change is driving more severe flooding across the country, the latest example being from the Northeast United States. But an NPR investigation finds the top federal housing agency is selling flood-prone homes to families without fully disclosing the risk. At the same time, the federal government is spending millions of dollars to move people out of flood zones. Rebecca Hersher from NPR.
So the piece on NPR from just a couple of weeks ago goes on to pick and somewhat cherry pick in some ways places where HUD sales are disproportionately in flood zones. So the piece gets a couple of things wrong and overlooks a couple of things. One, that HUD is charged with dispossessing these properties as quickly as possible, that it's state laws that dictate risk disclosures and property disclosures at the point of exchange, and HUD has to comply with those state laws. That HUD doesn't have funds for elevating and mitigating a lot of these properties, and that demolishing them simply takes them off the housing market, which is actually less of an equitable position for low-income, moderate households in the area. And also the program that they're mentioning that HUD is moving people out of harm's way is one grantee from one competitive HUD grant program, the Ile de Jean Charles relocation program in Louisiana. What's good about the article, though, is that it points to the lack of broader principles that the federal government is employing and the creation of consistent policy about equity and really about housing resilience largely. Now, HUD can certainly do a better job in the long term, but these gaps currently exist right now. And so today, what I'm going to be talking about are current policies. I'll talk a little bit about the current proposals and reforms for policy across the federal government, but really it's about the issues of contradictions and the complete oversight of equity in these policies. Now, there are a lot of reasons for these policies, climate denial being one of them, and the lack of real action on them. But again, I want to talk more about where we are at this point and where we can go in the future. So, and just to clarify, speaking of terminology confusion, when I'm talking about housing resilience, I'm talking about climate adaptation, hazard mitigation, all the various adaptive strategies to environmental risks that households and individual properties can take, as well as the local housing markets in response to those hazards. So I'm especially interested in the hazards related to climate change. That's a range of hazards, but I'm not talking about resilience that is not environmentally related. I mean, people talk about resilience in a lot of different ways. I want to be sure that we're talking about environmental hazards. There are 4 takeaways I want you to have. First, understanding the range of exposure that various housing in this country is subjected to. Second is that vulnerability, social vulnerability is different, and housing vulnerability is different from exposure, from the opportunity, the probability that an event is going to happen. Important to keep those distinctions, distinct, but it's also important to realize that both are works in progress in terms of scholarship and the advice that we're giving to policymakers around these areas. Third, as you'll figure out, both exposure and vulnerability are very place-based. That means the federal government only has a specific role in what it can do and the kinds of resources it gives. And so much of this work has to be carried out by state and local government. Fourth is that all of these policies currently exacerbate inequity and inequality. Not that they're just neutral, they're actually making things worse. And so we have to think about improvements, partially because they're separate programs in completely different agencies run by different people. So there has to be a consistency that's set up, so to make sure that there aren't unintended effects from the maximization of one program to another. So let's first talk about exposures. So what do we know homes need to be made resilient from? Whenever I've had this conversation in the past, I always like to start talking about the one incident, the one event that really changed the conversation in this country. And of course, I'm talking about Hurricane Katrina, the August 2005 event that devastated Southeast, particularly the New Orleans region, as well as Western Mississippi. 800 deaths, $125 billion in damage. Certainly transformative for New Orleans in a wide range of reasons, for pivoting New Orleans demographically after that, for causing lots of confusion about regulatory requirements and changes that needed to occur within the city itself. but most notably on the housing side, because of a major lawsuit that the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center launched against the state of Louisiana and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that was settled in 2011. But the lawsuit was based on the fact that the assistance programs that were set up for housing recovery after Katrina by the state of Louisiana put the damages based on the pre-Katrina value of people's homes. So low to moderate income homeowners, particularly African-American homeowners in this region, were screwed in the process, essentially. Their homes, for a variety of racist histories and legacies of this investment, were undervalued compared to the wealthier white counterparts. So the lawsuit contended that it should actually be a more neutral amount of damage that has occurred in the cost for repairing that damage rather than the pre-assessed value. As I mentioned, the lawsuit was settled in 2011, and it certainly was a transformation point in our emergency management perspective, as well as what happened in New Orleans. We noticed an ailing US infrastructure, the legacy of racism and wealth disparity, and services that previously were viewed by the lay general public as neutral, something that an emergency response has been a neutral factor. And of course, most importantly, that the magnitude and unprecedented nature of these events was expanding, that the exposure was growing. So let's talk a little bit more about that exposure, because my concern, and I talk a lot about Katrina, Sandy, Harvey, Maria, Camp Fire. The concern with a lot of the focus on these big disasters is that they distort two critical realities. One is that those disasters are the ones that get a lot of federal investments. It may be not enough, and it may not be distributed equitably, but they get a lot of investment. And they also get private sector forbearance on debt, on mortgages, et cetera. The smaller scale disasters, that is the lesser severe events, as well as the chronic events that are particularly associated with climate change that aren't acute events, are the ones that are going to be increasing as much. We're going to have more exposure from these as much as we're going to have the frequency and severity of the extreme events. So the distortion is that we're not paying attention. Our federal policy isn't paying attention to the smaller and the chronic events, as well as thinking that resilience is a long-term condition, not just something you do in response to an event. So we have a distorted idea of how these events play out. The picture that you see is actually Worcester, Mass, just from a couple of weeks ago. So oftentimes in these cases, in smaller incidences that have just as much effect on an individual household that's suffering through it, these households are left to their own devices. So let's talk about these exposures a little more. The chronic exposures that I'm particularly interested in that relate to climate change. Just last month, these are the reports for August of the record temperatures compared to the last 120 plus years of months in the US history since NOAA started documenting a lot of these environmental conditions, going back to 1895. So in August, several counties had record high heat, record high temperatures. That's what you see on the left. Northern Maine, places like parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, even Orange County, Florida. And this is just from August compared to the previous 120 years. Precipitation, I also am concerned with. Most people focus on the extreme precipitation, the record wettest. I also want to make sure that we're looking at the record driest. There are several counties in Northern and Central California, as you can see, that have their record driest just in the month of August. And if you track NOAA data, you see that every month, some new place has its record. So these are the kind of chronic events that I think we need to be paying attention to as much as others. So what does this mean for homes? Sea level rise is one of the chronic effects that's one of the effects that state and local governments are actually paying a lot of attention to. In fact, I've seen a lot of state and local government plans that only talk about sea level rise, even when sea level rise isn't necessarily the most critical climate change effect that jurisdiction is going to be experiencing. But in either case, I'm showing you a slide from our colleagues at First Street Foundation, which is a group of various scholars that are really pushing the boundaries about what flood exposure actually is. So not just basing on past FEMA flood maps, for example, and precedent, but also looking at projections based on climate change by real-time climate change data. as well as looking at bringing it down to the granular level of properties. So according to First Street Foundation, right now there are already a little over 19,000 properties that are at risk of flooding from sea level rise just in the city of Boston. So that's right now, 19,000. By 2050, that's just in 30 years, less than 30 years, there'll be about 28,000 properties just in the city of Boston. Now, if you think about it, in Boston, that's about 1/10 of Boston's current housing. So that's a lot. That's not just a good portion of the properties are at risk. The exposure is even more daunting for assisted housing units. Our great friends at Climate Central and the National Housing Trust decided to take the same data and let's look at assisted housing units throughout the country. And in Boston, right now, there are about 3,000 properties that are at risk. By 2100, it'll be about 14,000 units of assisted housing in the city of Boston alone. So last count, I think there were about 55,000 assisted units in Boston. So that's a quarter of the assisted housing unit stock. So we're talking about a significant portion of the housing stock that will be exposed. And recall that a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're not talking about the locale, the specificities of that exposure, geographically and demographically. We often do these broad swath studies across the nation or across regions about vulnerability. But as anybody knows, particularly as housers, housing markets are often local. The social histories are very localized, and clearly environments is very localized. EPA released a study on vulnerability last month that described exposures and the likelihood of different groups being exposed to different kinds of events. So this is a combination of the low income and the minority, low income on the left, minority on the right, likelihood of exposures to different kinds of climate change effects based on a 2-degree warming or 4 degrees Celsius global warming. I call your attention to the bottom 2 rows across both of these. So as you can see, low income households with a 2-degree Celsius level warming are projected to have about 16% more likelihood of coastal flooding than their wealthier counterparts. By 4 degrees, it's about 15%, so pretty much holding. But inland flooding, they're actually, it's a significantly less likelihood. When you look at minorities, actually coastal flooding and inland flooding are actually, they're less likely to have that exposure at a 2-degree warming. That dramatically leaps, obviously in the 4 degrees Celsius for coastal flooding up to 49%. But when you're looking at these aggregates, you're not looking at sort of the uniqueness of the specific demographic and environmental conditions in a place. So for example, on the minority 2-degree warming, you're not looking at the range of Latinos in the United States living in the Southwest and drought-prone areas balanced out with, for example, African-American communities in the Southeast that are subjected to higher coastal flooding. So it's important to be very specific about your exposure. So this is the end point. Remember, point number 1, be aware of exposures, of physical, environmental exposures, and then how they are likely displaced differently by geography and demography. Second is vulnerability. So vulnerability, I want to be very clear, is a very distinct concept from exposure. Exposure is your probability and the effects of the hazard event. Vulnerability is your capacity, the underlying social, economic, and political capacity to access resources and information and tools to prepare for or respond to the exposure. So vulnerability also obviously plays a lot in sort of the same kind of demographies that we're seeing. You can think about this, just to make sure that vulnerability is clear from your head from exposure. You can be less exposed physically to a hurricane, right? But if you don't have the resources, the kind of housing quality, the access to services and to political authorities that some of your peers have, that hurricane could actually hit you more severely, even though you're less exposed. So that said, their vulnerability studies have been worked out very well in the disaster management field in particular, but it's a wide range of factors that are considered as contributing to vulnerability. A lot of these are ones that you would guess: income, wealth, race, or rather exposure to racism, to persistent racism, are important ones. So I want to talk about one of these, and that's the issue of wealth. Colleagues and I, led by my former colleague, Carolyn Ratcliffe, looked at the effect of disasters on credit scores, for example. What we found was disasters lead to broad and often substantial negative measures of financial health. And this is true across a lot of different measures of health. The negative effects persist up until the 4th year after. And I want to remind you that, or let you know that our data only went up to 4 years. So it's likely that these effects could even be longer term than just past the 4th year. So there are 2 points that I want to bring up here. One is the original point that I made up about medium-sized disasters, so not the big severe disasters, but the smaller ones, right? So on the left-hand side, you see Hurricane Sandy effects on disaster. And the right-hand side are the medium-sized disaster around the same time. We're looking at 2011 to 2014 timeframe for disasters. The average for the medium-sized disasters was about a 22-point decline in credit scores for the whole population of people who were exposed and in medium-sized disasters to comparison groups. On the Hurricane Sandy side, it was about 7 credit point lower. That's because, again, the big disasters get the forbearance, get the massive infusion of federal investment, but the medium-sized disasters don't. So the other point I want to bring up is then looking at the disparities by vulnerability by group. The yellow line in both of the charts are people who had poor credit scores prior to the events. So on the left side, you see Hurricane Sandy. So by the 4th year, the people with poor credit scores were worse off than their peers. Not by that much more, but certainly the most, and it was about an 8-point decline. On the medium-sized disasters, though, people with poor credit scores were down by almost 29 points in their credit scores to the comparison groups. So I've talked a little about the household contributors, the household demography and income related to vulnerability. Let's talk about some housing specific vulnerability factors. And I always like to remind people that we still have housing quality issues in this country, starting with just basic housing quality that often are dictated by housing tenure and household income and race, the other demographic factors. So if you look at this slide, this is severely or moderately inadequate housing, broken out by the proportions per group, per income group, per tenure group, and by racial group. So the orange bars are tenure income groups. So clearly renters, lower income renters, at those making less than 40,000 are more likely to live in severely or moderately inadequate housing. So it's about a little over 9% of that population lives in severely or moderately inadequate housing, compared to the about 2% of homeowners that make more than 80,000. And there's a racial slide here as well. American Indian and Alaska Native household, about 8.5% of that population live in severely or moderately inadequate housing. Now, again, this is the first point, that there's basic substandard housing issues that still basic plumbing, electrical, structural deficiencies. This is doesn't even account for the housing quality issues related to the environmental hazards that we're talking about today. So we don't know the number of homes that are able to withstand hurricane force winds, those that are elevated to overcome flood damage, or those that have roofing material or landscaping to reduce fire exposure and flammability. So there's a whole range of housing quality issues that will be contributing to this vulnerability pool, and that science needs to be advanced more. So I also want to talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities that are mirrored after these disaster effects, because we primarily know about vulnerabilities after the disasters occurred. So in terms of federal policy, we know that there are a range of public assistance that occur, again, primarily for larger severe disasters. And most of these, like disaster SNAP, disaster unemployment, et cetera, are fairly short-lived. There's only a small couple months that households, particularly the most severely impacted households, have access to those resources. The housing recovery, which is that bottom line of application and eligibility period, don't really kick in for a year and a half at best after the event has started. So there's this whole valley of death that occurs. So timing is also, and people's vulnerabilities are factored into these questions about how much time and persistence people can withstand before they sort of drop out of these programs. And indeed, there are lots of ways that people slip through these cracks, not just by waiting forever for assistance for their individual housing recovery. We've tracked at least 5 different ways in which this has happened, everything from the damage assessment and inconsistencies, particularly in low-income communities and communities of color, of damage assessments by federal assessors, all the way through the ability to apply, just the bandwidth, internet bandwidth, and physical ability to go, or physical ability to go to an FEMA registration site. They're all the way through the longer-term waits for aid that I mentioned already, the eligibility processes that create thresholds to address by federal government statute the most severely affected unmet needs that remain, where there are a lot of unmet needs for lower income households that are small and affect those specific households just as much as a bigger loss would affect a wealthier household. So, and my biggest concern, of course, is that there is no consistency. There's a lot of bureaucracy across all the federal programs, not to mention how those are implemented at the state and local level. So there are a lot of ways that people slip through the cracks. But again, this is the big point on vulnerability issues, that there are a range of vulnerability factors that determine people's ability and people's housing ability to be resilient. You know, social, economic access that exists before the disaster event happens and that are worsened by them. So let's talk about policy. So it's important for you all to know, and I've hinted at this a little bit, that US climate policy is not environmental policy. US climate policy is not social or economic policy. US climate policy historically has been disaster policy. So we respond to the crisis. That means a lot of problems, right? One is that we dole out the equivalent of 1/16 of the funding that we give to the post-disaster relief, response, recovery. About 1/16 of that, let me repeat that, 1/16, 1/6 of that amount of money to preparedness and mitigation. So if we believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, we really need to start really thinking about where we're investing our funds to ensure that we're addressing these long-term vulnerabilities, as well as how they may play out to expected exposures. There are a lot of other problems associated with this approach to our policy, right? One is that property is valued over people. We wait until the damages hit and we assess the damages to a property rather than thinking about the living conditions and the social conditions of that housing in which people were living in before the disaster. We think about precedent, right? Because we have to wait for the disaster to occur to invest, rather than thinking about projecting in the future, which is absolutely critical when it comes to climate planning in this country and globally. We have to start thinking about what will happen in the near future, as well as the long term. Third, we're always in crisis mode. So crisis appropriations are made, which then tend to be devoid of any real understanding of local land use, social histories locally, a variety of local place-based things. It's just a matter of infusing money to deal with the crisis. And fourth, and I hear this all the time, it's logistically unsustainable. It costs a lot of money to be investing after these disaster effects. So unfortunately, our climate policy has become one of public expenditures debates rather than discussing about the public commons. So here's a case in point. I think in the last seminar, Dan talked about the expansion of $1 million plus disasters and the increasing frequency of them. Well, our public coffers are going through the same thing. So what you see are the disaster relief fund appropriations over the last 40, 50 years, almost 50 years, right? Where we see peaks from Katrina, but we see clearly there's a clear pattern here that we're spending as much money as the number of disasters are expanding. So the 2013 Sandy peak, the 2017 Harvey, Maria Camp peak, the 2020 Greek letter alphabets and Western fires, there's a clear pattern. But what you also see only is disaster relief funds appropriations to FEMA. We're not looking at all of the additional funds, particularly those that relate specifically to housing. FEMA assistance typically only goes to minor repairs that allow habitability, like basic habitability and reoccupancy of units. The HUD funding is what goes to recovery. And that's in a whole other chunk and change. In fact, since 2017, we've invested almost $30 billion just in HUD funding post-disaster. So where does this money go? You're looking at FEMA assessed damage and a 10-year period. This is bookended by Katrina and Sandy. And clearly because of those specific events, you see that the Gulf and the New York City area got a lot of damage. And so one would assume that proportionally, but there are a lot of other places that had other presidential declarations that from which there was housing loss. When we look at where this money goes to, we're looking at some clear political processes. Some jurisdictions get a lot more for a variety of reasons. One is that the state and presidential declaration process is a political one, and the decisions by states and the president to make decisions. We saw this recently under the Trump administration and COVID disaster declarations. I do want to note that tribal nations were only allowed to ask for presidential declarations in 2013 during Obama. It started in the Obama years. Prior to that, tribes had to go through their respective geographic counties and states, and one can imagine that kind of relationship that has pre-existed. Once a declaration happens, then of course, then it's a question of Congress and congressional delegations arguing for supplemental appropriations and what that value of supplemental appropriations are, which are only partially based on damage assessment. It also has a lot to do with political power of that congressional delegation. Then once those appropriations are made, that filters down to state and local government. In fact, there's a lot of debate, particularly with regard to CDBGDR, the housing recovery funding, about states versus counties versus cities getting the funds, and what happens when the state government has a different political party and different set of actors than the local ones. This is especially true in Texas post-Harvey. So even these channels, just to distribute the household level assistance, have some equity considerations that we're not fully addressing. So let's look at the household level. Once that goes out to the funds go out to households. So the vast majority of funds in that same timeframe, 2005 to 2015, and still currently, go to homeowners. So about 80% of the funds go to homeowner compensation and rehab programs to help existing homeowners repair because they have unmet needs, repair their properties or rebuild the new, et cetera, or to buy them out. Only about 12% of funds go to affordable rental housing. And that money, of course, is to build new affordable rental housing to compensate for any that was taken off stock. But remember that I said that it takes about 1.5 years just for these housing programs to start. Well, it takes about 4.5 years for the affordable rental housing to finally be rebuilt. So you can imagine that a lot of those renters who were displaced or have suffered damages at the disaster 4.5 years later are not necessarily the same ones who are going to occupy this rental housing. That doesn't really compensate for previous gaps in the local rental housing markets anyway. So remember, point 3, that risk, which is a combination of both exposure and vulnerability, is very place specific. That means that unfortunately our policy is based only on emergencies. So we lose the opportunity to think thoughtfully about a fair distribution and the specificity of the places in terms of their land use policies, their regulatory policies, their existing capacities, and then we don't distribute the funding appropriately across these levers of governmental assistance. As a consequence, benefits are far from equitable. So let's talk a little bit more about equity. So I mentioned there is no cohesive federal strategy, let alone an equitable strategy that's associated with this. And there are a range of conversations that are happening right now. Some of these are legislative, some of these are executive. Some of these are related to reforming what's there. For example, finally making CDBG DR a statutorily authorized program. Some of these relate to program rules. FEMA individual assistance program rules just finally made a switch in August regarding allowing alternative ways of proving title to property to allow low income, particularly communities of color, to access some of the individual assistance housing repair programs. And certainly we know that the National Flood Insurance Program is going through massive legislative reform constantly. You saw a New York Times article just this past weekend around this. Some of what's going on is reinstating the basic low bars. For example, in May, Biden issued an executive order that reinstated the Federal Flood Management Standard that just requires federal agencies to consider the flood effects of future climate change when they're making investments in public infrastructure and potentially in specific housing developments. And that was just the Obama administration had instituted that executive order, and the Trump administration had withdrawn it a week before Hurricane Harvey hit Texas. So there are a range of pieces and parts that are developing. Some of these are new interventions that we're seeing. The Federal Housing Finance Agency, of course, had listening sessions about the risks to securitizing highly exposed properties by the GSEs, is one big example. But again, so there's a mishmash in what's there, but all of what we're talking about are specific disaster-related programs and policies. We're overlooking two big things. One is the myriad ways in which the federal government encourages social and economic viability in places that may not be physically viable. This includes transportation funds, a wide range of social programming and services, you name it, across the board. So everything, because we assume that it's crisis related, and that's where all the policy needs to change, we're overlooking the fact that other decision making by the federal government is allowing for places to build poorly, to continue not addressing equity issues locally, but in a way that will affect the climate work. The second point is that we're also forgetting that federal government only plays a partial role in what happens locally. Federal government doesn't necessarily discourage bad behavior in terms of land use planning, and across a broad range of other issues, infrastructure, which is primarily funded by state and local government, building codes, et cetera. So it's this business as usual pool of the policy that needs to be addressed as much as the climate crisis programming that we have right now. Fortunately, there is a bit of a change. We hear of massive new investment in hazard mitigation now that's occurring in this administration. There's also a culture of equity that's being addressed, a culture of reparation and justice, as much as a culture of adaptation and climate preparation that we're starting to see. So what could equitable programs look like? So in a little exercise that we did with Texas housers immediately in Texas after Hurricane Harvey, we looked at the thresholds of, and again, I'm talking right now about post-disaster equity issues. And the threshold for HUD assistance was that a homeowner had to have at least $8,000 worth of unmet need of continuing damage to be eligible for assistance, and a renter had to have $2,000 worth of verified loss. So the problem with that, of course, is if you have less than that, that may be just as much of an effect, particularly if you're extremely low income. So we suggested creating a change in the threshold requirements that was adjusted by weighing the threshold by an average income per group. So it was a progressive threshold, as well as the population of disaster affected households in each of those income groups, to allow lower income, extremely low income people at least more ability to be part of the recovery program. Of course, this also benefits the communities in which these households live, because then a wider number of people are on the path towards recovery, and the community can recover this more quickly. So let's talk about a post-disaster equity example. Let's talk about a pre-disaster example. Most households that live in what are SRL and RL, severe repeat loss properties or repeat loss properties, are actually not extremely wealthy. The average owner of these properties, and this is as defined by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, so properties that have repeated flood losses, the average income is about $69,000. Yet, according to FEMA's own analysis, only 19% of the interventions to mitigate these properties, including buyouts, go to the most severely vulnerable populations. So work done by colleagues, at Jim Elliott at Rice, Catherine Mock at University of Miami, has shown that results in wealthier and wider communities benefiting more from these mitigation programs. And so this is a long-term concern regarding how we think about the pre-mitigation investments. A more equitable intervention would, of course, be a phased, means-tested assistance program for low-income property owners to access hazard insurance, but also thinking about more incentives targeted to lower income communities for mitigation and buyouts, including making sure that we have affordable housing built in less exposed areas. I think about programs like New Jersey's Blue Acres program that does buyouts with FEMA funds, but also contributed with state funds to provide wraparound services for low-income residents. So you're not just buying out the program, but you're helping people move to a safe place and a place that they can live in with their own decision-making tools. I think about programs that we can learn from in the housing world, like Hope 6, where we learned, and oftentimes the hard way, about how to relocate people with wraparound services appropriate to their needs. So these are all lessons that from the housing world that I think we need to be contributing much more. So there's one more case I want to talk about. So I'm still talking about pre-disaster mitigation. I want to talk about the infrastructure that goes on ideally to support residential communities. And there's been a good move in that side. I mean, this used to be a purview of the Army Corps and parts of FEMA. Now FEMA is investing much more. And clearly the BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, is actively looking at its equity concerns after it just gave its first awards this year. July 2020 were the first announcements of awards. And the Biden administration has proposed $5 billion more worth of FEMA mitigation. But in this specific past round, there was one project that was awarded out of all these bubbles that you see right there. That got the highest amount and has gotten a lot of attention. So let me point it out to you too. This one right here, which is the largest funded project out of the BRIC program, $50 million to date. And it's the East Palo Alto, Menlo Park area in California. The project is intended to build levee and flood walls that will prevent future flooding from the bay, but also protect an electrical substation that serves 300,000 people. It improves wildlife, including the habitat for an endangered bird species, and it protects 16,000 properties, most of which are low-income residential homes in the city of East Palo Alto. But there's an interesting other beneficiary to this project that has gotten a lot of attention with regard to equity issues.
Helena says questions about fairness have been coming up in the community as they've been hearing about these plans to build a levee.
Their plan included Facebook, that we had to share our resources, which they're supposed to be protecting us with Facebook. And it was kind of irritating.
Here's how it breaks down. To build the new levee, East Palo Alto is putting in $5.5 million. Facebook is putting in a bit more, $7.8 million. That's enough to protect just one section of their campus, not the whole thing. And the company's revenue is 2,000 times greater than East Palo Alto's city budget.
Wow.
The federal government, through FEMA, just preliminarily awarded the project $50 million, and hundreds of other projects around the country, who also applied for that funding, including low-income communities, got nothing. So
the questions about who beneficiaries are when you are including low and moderate income households is the focus of that NPR article. And there is some concern. I call it, for lack of a better word, and it's a bit polemic to say this, but low to moderate income beards to ensure that wealthier communities also get their share of benefits. So there is a concern about how beneficiaries are defined and how they're calculated such that you're not just providing equal protection, but you're actually making sure that the historically disadvantaged communities are prioritized in this. Fortunately, Executive Order 12898 was one of the first out of the Biden, the week of the Biden inauguration, that has created this this mantra and this program known as Justice 40, in which 40% of all overall benefits of investments, of federal investments, must flow to disadvantaged communities. This is very much a work in progress. There's been guidance around how to define community and how to define disadvantaged communities. But the bigger issue here is then, how does this get measured? What is that 40% of benefits and who the beneficiaries are is going to be an ongoing issue. So I won't belabor the point about how I define equity, other than to say we need to think about all of these programs and all of the spectrum of stages. So everything from addressing historical inequities that exist in communities that have defined what that disadvantage is, to looking at the exposures. Remember the importance of looking at current and future exposures exposures, environmental exposures, and exposed populations. And then looking at what those vulnerabilities, pre-existing vulnerabilities are to those exposures. And then talking about inclusion. And inclusion, I don't just mean the usual engagement processes that communities have in terms of deciding infrastructure, but actually making community members of all backgrounds be part of staff that make decisions, be contractors, be part of the workforce that helps make these decision-making processes. This is where real equity comes in addition to looking at the outcomes and the access disparities that exist. So we're going to face the challenge of optimizing one program in the federal government, of course, when we're doing this, that may have disproportionate effects on housing inequity. And this tension that I mentioned before around housing access and affordability versus addressing environmental and climate concerns is one that has to be addressed, but we have to make sure that we're looking at the whole of government effort behind this. So that was the fourth point. Current policies exacerbate inequity. So we need to envision better policy that deals with all of these unintended consequences. We have to have principles of equity that are guiding us and that are centering the lives, livelihoods, and living conditions of disadvantaged communities rather than just trying to maximize one program. So if our housing policies have resulted in inequitable outcomes, well, guess what? Our environmental and climate policies that build on those housing policies that are fitting the environmental square peg into the housing circle hole are going to be ongoing issues. So we need to have better data on exposures. We need to pay more attention to pre-hazard social and housing vulnerabilities. We need to have more federal resources. Quite frankly, that's probably the biggest arbiter of how we move forward. We also have to have better cross-agency and cross-jurisdictional governance. And ultimately, we have to have federal sticks. We can no longer have federal carrots to incentivize local governments to stop bad development and to encourage them to think about population and economic development in less exposed areas, including building affordable housing in those areas that are less exposed and providing wraparound services for highly vulnerable, highly exposed populations. When we think about non-housing effects that make successful housing, jobs, health, cultural network, everything that makes that housing a little more tenable. Every way that federal policy supports or even touches housing is going to be affected by climate change. So we've got to get to work. And in case you were wondering about that roller coaster from before, I do want to tie up on this. The roller coaster was rebuilt 4 years after Sandy in May 2017, and now it's the Hydrus roller coaster. But as you can see, now it's built above on a new boardwalk that's 12 feet above the beach. Thank you very much. And I realize I gave you a lot, so hopefully I'm happy to answer some questions as we go along.
Carlos, thank you for just a really extraordinary kind of overview, and I really appreciate particularly the reframing or the framing that you've given. I have two questions about displacement, and I'll give them to you sequentially. So the first is you had pretty stunning data about how long it takes to get the money to rebuild rental housing, and actually it actually looked like the timeline even for homeowners was so much longer. And we know particularly from Katrina that a lot of people just never came back to New Orleans. What do we know, or what can you say about displacement given those long time frames in terms of who comes back, who who leaves, and magnitudes?
Yeah, I could have planted this question, everybody, but I didn't. I mean, thank you, David, for that, because that's my other bit of soapbox about in the managed retreat conversation that a lot of people are having in this country about long-term displacement from future risk as well as those that we just saw. If we look at past disasters, we know that most people displaced, and I'm happy to send people more information around this, are displaced for about up to a year. They try to relocate as close by as possible because they want to keep their jobs, their school districts. I mean, what we do as people, right? We want to maintain our networks as much as possible. The reality is we have zero federal policy around long-term investment. In fact, last year, a year and a half ago, the GAO came out with CRF, they're going to kill me, my friends at which federal agency, but came out with a proposed pilot on climate migration pilot. And one of the areas that I've been working in significantly is looking at, well, what happens to those housing markets, those employment bases, where people leave from and where they go to. The reality is it depends. We don't have consistent data around where people move to. Elizabeth Fussell at Brown University, my colleague, is doing the Yo Woman's work in trying to calculate from past events where people go to. But the reality is it depends a lot on severity and there are some clear demographic characteristics about who tends to return and who doesn't. When we look at where people go to and why they stay there for permanent reasons, I was doing a study with RAND and Enterprise Community Partners around, and 3 great local partners, Texas Southern University, University of New Orleans, and University of Central Florida, looking at the displaced people and how they're received where they go to. And the reality is housing markets there are not fully prepared for those changes. They haven't, so people make do with what they're on with whatever FEMA assistance they got in the long term. So this is going to be an ongoing issue. So to answer your question, the length of their movement and displacement will vary, but we know that this is going to happen much more. We're seeing record numbers of displaced. I highly encourage you all to look at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the IDMC, which is monitoring globally. And just examples from the US recently. The Oregon fires from a year ago, 1 million people were temporarily displaced, at least for the first month. And so this is going to keep happening. And we have we don't even track this federally.
The second question about displacement is thinking about, as you talked about, there are places that are chronically subject to disasters where policy might encourage people or force people to leave. There's a long history of federal policies, highways, urban renewal, displacing people who didn't want to be replaced. So, one question is if you identify an area, how do you do it in a way that's fair, particularly that you don't pull the rug out of its real estate market if it's a low and moderate income community, but also are there examples of ways to carry out that process so that people feel like they had a voice as opposed to just being forced to move when they perhaps didn't want to?
Yeah, and I mean, the problem with the inequities of our past decision are that the local communities they never have a say in this, right? It's not that local communities are absolutely averse to moving, right? Local residents, it's that they need to be the ones in the decision-making process about how they envision their communities and their own households. So we actually saw that after Katrina, for example, a lot of the households that moved preferred where they moved to. They actually found better living conditions, better housing than what they had in their Katrina life. But they had to do that all on their own. There was no formal decision-making process that centered those residents in what they needed to happen. So it has to start off with local conversation. That's absolutely critical. And then decision-making process about what to go. There are some really interesting cases. Again, these are from smaller events, but more like chronic flooding that we've seen in places like Nebraska and Missouri, where a small group of households were viewed as needing to be moved because the risks were so extreme, but they needed to decide that on their own. They realized the risks that they faced, the kinds of wraparound services that would make it amenable for them to move. We've seen some good and some bad examples. I'm thinking about particularly around Hurricane Sandy and the additional buyout incentives, where whole communities in Staten Island and Long Island were incentivized to move. And it's a mixed bag on the stories about those. I certainly encourage folks to look at colleagues' work like Alex Greer and Sherry Benderkoff, who have been tracking those communities. But part of the problem, at least from my standpoint as a researcher, is that we don't even know who these are and where these are happening because there's no consistent tracking of them. But there are examples of people saying, whole communities saying, yeah, I'm okay with moving. I accept the reality of what my environmental exposure is, and I need something to deal with my vulnerabilities and where I'm going to. So you have to give me the right mix of housing, job access, schools for my kids, things that we all want from a regular community, let alone one that's exposed.
I thought your point about using Hope 6 as a model, the kind of wraparound service was really interesting. There are two questions here which I, at least in my mind, are going to connect. Hopefully I get these right. One is the very broad point that often getting aid is a function of how well and how much capacity you have to document that aid, and either smaller jurisdictions or jurisdictions that just don't have a lot of resources often lack that. And the question I'm sort of relating to that, we had a separate question about looking in the context of the Rio Grande Valley, where affected communities are often colonias, where it's not even clear how much of ownership and tenure has been documented. So how do you deal with either the situation of just not having the folks who can fill out all the forms correctly, and in some cases may not even have the documentation that you might need to get the help you need?
Right. So on the first point, in terms of like the actual jurisdiction, being able to apply, do the right applications, and there's overlap with households that are more equipped, but I focus more on the jurisdictions that historically weren't allowed to even access, but let alone have the capacity to write the best competitive grant programs. I mean, I'm increasingly of the mindset that we have to start thinking about climate entitlement communities more than competitive grant programs, because the competitive grant programs is going to be the same wealthier communities that know how to hire the right consultants and do all the right scientific analysis to make their cases. And we kind of saw that in some of the recent competitive award making that's occurred. So there has to be a real contended effort to provide with entitlement, lower revenue entitlement communities, the resources, the technical, the science background, the community organizing capacities, all of these additional capacity building efforts that are necessary for them. For at the household level, I mean, this is actually what keeps me awake at night. The thought that to do effective engagement with communities and residents that are underserved and that have been historically underserved, and like the climate community engagement 101 is you have to invest in long-term trust building, confidence building, and we don't have the luxury of that time. So I have a real concern about making sure that additional resources are provided on that community engagement side. And it's a challenge, right? Because it's community engagement with this string, holding up that this has to happen at a certain time point. You guys have to make decisions about what you want to do in your community, and we have to figure out what resources are available. But it's going to be an ongoing issue on how we build capacity among jurisdictions, low underserved jurisdictions, as well as historically disadvantaged households. And I wish I had a better answer, but this is a work in progress.
Let me unmute myself. One quick final question, which really relates to the work of the National Academies panel and of that ilk. The idea of decarbonizing the U.S. economy as a way to perhaps reduce the number of disasters. The residential sectors, if that's going to happen, is going to play a key role. To what extent, how do you bring some of these same considerations to thinking about that piece of work? What would it mean to decarbonize the residential sector in a way that took equity into account? And you have 37 seconds before.
So absolutely the same vulnerability factors play out in access to energy, renewable energy, and energy efficiency, and the electrification programs. So it's important to think about those. There is going to be an equity chapter in the decarbonization report. And it's important, again, for me, is to fixate on the household and their housing conditions as we approach these. And that housing issue hasn't been foregrounded in either adaptation or climate mitigation, to answer your question.
We've hit, I try to keep us solid to our closing time. want to share with folks, as I mentioned, the Remodeling Futures program has, for over 2 decades been tracking the industry. It is a program that was started and then headed for all that time by Kermit Baker. And when we found out that Kermit was actually really going to retire, I think many of us, both in the center and outside the center, really worried about, well, what's going to happen next? It was a classic, what happens when the founder leaves? And we were really excited when you applied. And I think folks who've been watching can see why we were so excited that I think you're going to be a great steward for this program. I'm looking forward to it continuing its great work, but also, as you said, there's a conversation that is really beginning among the housers and the environmental folks and the disaster preparedness folks that is long overdue. And I'm really thrilled that you and therefore the center are going to be part of it. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I know how hard it was to cram as much information in as you did, and I appreciate it. And I'm sure folks will appreciate knowing that both the presentation and the slides will be available on the website. And I encourage you to keep following the Remodeling Futures program, because we're looking forward to seeing more of this work. So on behalf of all those people out there who have been watching, thank you for a terrific presentation.
Thank you. That's so sweet of you, David. And just everybody out there, you're housers, you're in the housing world. Please, we need all hands on deck.
And with that, we will see you hopefully in 2 weeks for the next Housing Research Seminar. Everybody have a great day and hope you have a wonderful weekend.